that I've been, that I was going to get a great birthday present today to have the presence of our new American Indian Justice, Raquel Montoya-Lewis today. And that's where I stand today, because I'm very honored to be able to have her here today on this day of the 4th ICWA Institute, the first Zoom. Just beyond honored. And as I have all week long, I have opened up in a good way. So please, one more time, I just want to thank our actor, our great spirit of giving us strength and beauty and knowledge and the ability to learn, to have our hearts open to the learning that we've had this week and continually learn throughout this time we have here on Mother Earth. I want to thank you for all the work that you do for our children and our families. I want to thank you so much for this opportunity to bring peace, love, and joy to our Indian families, to the healing, to the beautiful avenue that each and every one of you hold in your heart. So in Kus Pu'us, you are all one heart. So with that, I am going to introduce, and I'm very honored to introduce Justice Raquel Montoya-Lewis. And as she was appointed to the Washington State Supreme Court by Governor Jay Inslee in December of 2000 of office on January 6, 2020. Justice Montoya-Lewis is an enrolled member of the Pueblo of Isla and a descendant of the Pueblo of Laguna, 2 federally recognized tribes in New Mexico. She is the first enrolled member of any tribe to sit on a state Supreme Court in the US, and the second Native American to sit on a state Supreme Court. She is also a descendant from Jewish. Prior to becoming Associate Justice, she served as a Supreme Court Justice for Whatcom County for 5 years. Let me get the tears out of my eye. She served as Superior Court in Whatcom County for 5 years, where she heard criminal and civil trials and presided over the Whatcom County Therapeutic Drug Court. In the last 15 years prior to her work on the Supreme Court, she served as a tribal judge for multiple tribes in the Pacific Northwest and Southwest. She served as chief judge for the Upper Skagit Indian tribe, the Nooksack Indian tribe, and the Lummi Nation. In addition to her work as a tribal court judge, she was tenured associate professor at Western Washington University's Fairhaven College, where she taught law-related courses and courses on cultural identity development. She has continued to use her teaching a wide variety of audiences, including judges, social workers, lawyers, and advocates on implicit bias, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and best practices in child welfare and domestic violence cases. Justice Montoya-Lewis graduated with her BA degree from the University of New Mexico in 1992 and completed her law degree and Master of Social Work degree at the University of Washington in 1995 and 1996, respectively. Wanting you to give us a beautiful welcome to our first American Indian woman, Justice Montoya-Lewis. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura Lee, and happy birthday.
Oh.
I'm really honored to be able to be here and talk to all of you, and I appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day and their week, not just to hear me, but I looked at the schedule that you have had all week, and you're really doing some important work here, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time sharing the screen, so you won't see me, but I do want to encourage you to ask questions through the chat and share your thoughts as well if you'd like to. And I wanted to sort of preface this by talking about the way in which I was taught to introduce myself. I was taught by my father and my grandparents that the proper way to introduce myself as a Native woman is to go back as far as it's possible to go back in my family tree and start there by introducing my ancestor and then moving forward each generation until I got to me. And the reason for that is to remind yourself and your community that the people who came before you are responsible for you being here today, and what they experienced is foundational to understanding yourself by understanding what they went through. That form of introduction is not typical in professional environments. And so I've had to adjust to being introduced by my accomplishments and those kinds of things. It's always been uncomfortable as a result of the way I was trained to introduce myself because I'm leading with the things that I've done as opposed to the people who I come from. And I've spent a lot of time over the course of doing public speaking and training, thinking about that conflict and what that means to me as someone who is more and more in the public eye. And being appointed to the Washington State Supreme Court only increased that. Certainly as a Superior Court judge, I had the opportunity to do training and teaching, but that has grown exponentially over the last 14 months or so, partially as a result of the campaign that I had to run, but just because people want to hear from Supreme Court justices, and being someone who is a first means that there are a lot of organizations, people, communities who want to hear from me about what that experience is. So I developed what I'm going to talk to you about today in part as a way of recognizing that tension between introducing myself through my ancestors and my relatives versus being introduced or introducing myself by my accomplishments and qualifications. So I'm going to, in a moment, just share the screen and tell you my story. And I will try to put that into context over the course of the time that we get to spend with each other today. And I wanted to just share with you where this comes from and why it is so important to me to be able to talk about the people who came before me. But I also don't want to downplay the importance of the introductions that focus on my accomplishments and my qualifications. And one of the reasons why I think that is so important now that I'm in this position with this significantly increased public visibility is because I have certainly experienced over the course of my career, and absolutely in the last year, a kind of belief from some people, certainly not all, but a lot of folks who assume that because I am a first, that I've benefited from getting an extra bump as a result of being a Native woman. And that really kind of flies in the face of what I was taught as a young person by my father, who really said to me, you're going to have to work many times harder than white people who will not have to work as hard to get the same or even more applause and credit for what they do. And that's absolutely been my experience. So I don't want to say that introductions by qualifications and accomplishments are not important. They are important. And I, over the course of my campaign last year, really learned that in even more concrete ways, that was really necessary for me to push back against many people's assumptions about who I am and how I got to be in the position that I'm very honored to be able to have now. So I'm going to share my screen, and there we go. But I also just want to encourage you, I can't really see the chat very well, but to ask questions as we move through this. So you should be seeing the slide for this talk that I have called Descendant Daughter. Is everyone able to see that? Just
Yes, Your Honor, we can see it.
Great, thank you. Sometimes Zoom is not my friend. So I'm going to start out by talking a little about some history. I know that most of you probably have some familiarity with this, but I think it's important to set some context for what I'm going to share with you in terms of my own family. So over the course of this country, from really before its establishment up through at least the 70s, and some would say through today, the federal government and state governments have spent a lot of time talking about what to do with the quote Indian problem. That may sound sort of dated to many of you today, but you can look at documents from the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the formerly named War Department, that referred to what to do about the fact that there were Indigenous people in this country at the time of first contact and beyond, what to do about that tension. And it was described in formal documents, and quite honestly, I've seen documents as late as the 80s describing this as the Indian problem. What do we do about the reality that this was not a country or a land that was untouched? It was a land that was inhabited. And the federal governments and state governments really struggled with what to do about that. So what I have on the screen here are a few of the approaches that were taken by the federal government to try to address this. You'll see that many of these overlap with each other, and the timeframes that I have on here are quite approximate because there were multiple approaches to trying to deal with this. Certainly some of these approaches before the Allotment Act were just warfare. And as a result of that kind of warfare, many thousands of Indigenous peoples from many hundreds of different tribes were killed as a result of the War Department and the federal government determining that the best way to deal with the Indian problem was outright war. And that certainly started happening at first contact and continued for quite a long time after that. But the Allotment Act is where I really think you begin to see sort of a formalized program to deal with the reality of Indigenous people being here. So the Allotment Act was an act created by Congress where the intention was to force Native people to focus less on communal values and community and more on nuclear families. The purpose was to teach Native people to function in the same way that that mainstream settlers did. So the federal government, and this was not across the board in all tribes, it was in many tribes, began to give individual male heads of household a certain amount of land. They would allot sometimes 10 acres, sometimes more, sometimes less. And the idea was to then teach and encourage those families to farm those allotments. There are many descriptions over the course of U.S. history, particularly in the earlier days, of the federal government viewing Native people as not working the land. There was very much a belief that the proper use of land was to be worked in some form for agricultural uses, for the raising of livestock, and they had an expectation about what that looked like. That it looked like, as you can imagine, organized rows of whatever the crop was. What they missed, and there are plenty of anthropologists and archaeologists who can describe this, was the fact that the land was being worked. It was just being worked in concert with nature in a way that wasn't immediately recognizable by those who believed it was important for Native people to work the land in a certain way. So as a result of this, what you ended up with is a number of tribes that had no real communal land like a reservation, and instead individual tribal members having pieces of property that they were encouraged to work in a certain way. That was also in addition to that, there was the Indian Removal Act, which was simply the idea that, well, we have all of these tribes in areas that are that we don't want them in, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, places like that. And so that was the consequence of the Indian Removal Act, was to say, well, they need to be moved to the west. And the idea there was to move them past the Mississippi. At that time, there was a belief that there wouldn't be sort of the formalized states beyond that area. Of course, that didn't end up to be the case, but there were places like the Indian territories in Oklahoma where tribes were removed to, and other things along those lines. You, I'm sure, are familiar with the Trail of Tears. The Allotment Act was, I think, by all accounts, a failure. And it was a failure because it did not recognize the way in which tribal communities functioned. Many of those tribal communities were matriarchal and not patriarchal or patrilineal. And so giving the property to the male heads of household was in direct contravention to the way that many tribes functioned. And so it just simply didn't make sense and it didn't work. So as a result of that failed experiment, eventually the federal government went back to the idea of reservations, but it created all kinds of long-term problems that plague reservations and created all kinds of legal problems on land that was allotted. Many pieces of property, once they were allotted to individual families, were sold by those families to non-Indians, who then began to own that property in fee simple, which means that they were able to do whatever they wanted with the land. They owned it entirely. And then once the reservations were reestablished, you ended up with non-natives living within the boundaries of the reservation. That creates all kinds of jurisdictional issues that were things that I dealt with as a tribal court judge all the time. Questions about what do you do when a crime, for example, starts on a piece of trust property that is part of the tribe's land and then spills over into a piece of fee simple property. Whose jurisdiction is that? Who is supposed to manage that. When I was in law school, the example that was given to me that I've always thought about is if someone is standing on reservation land and fires a gun that crosses, and the bullet crosses over into fee simple land and hits someone there, where did the crime occur? And the reason that's important is that whoever is, that determines who's going to prosecute. It also creates problems in child welfare up through today with questions similar in regards to jurisdiction. So there are all sorts of consequences from these things that occurred in the 1800s that affect us today. So as I said, that was an unsuccessful approach to dealing with the Indian problem. And so there was another formalized program by the federal government that was described as assimilation. And the idea there was to remove, so if allowing Native people to remain on their ancestral homelands or on a reservation that they were moved to, didn't work to change Native people from focusing on their own tribes and communities into being much more individually driven and looking like settler or colonizer families. Since that didn't work, there was another program or approach that was, well, maybe if we remove those people from their communities, from their tribes, and send them to urban areas, and maybe that will result in their assimilation. That, I have here 1870s to 1920s. That's really not completely accurate. The idea of removing Native people from their homelands and sending them to urban areas happened up through the 1960s. I have friends who grew up, for example, in Los Angeles, whose parents were put on a bus that ended up in Los Angeles, where they then raised their families away from their tribes. And it resulted in all kinds of real challenges for those families and for the tribes themselves. There are significant Native communities in urban areas, which is something that I think many judges who do child welfare work don't understand. And I think for those of you that are appearing in court, sometimes that may be important to educate the decision makers on, as well as the attorneys, and sometimes even the families that you're working with. There are huge numbers of Native people living in places like Seattle, Los Angeles, New York City, who were there as a result of this policy. And that policy resulted in significant disconnections between those families and their tribes. So as you might imagine, that approach didn't work to end the Indian problem. So there was another approach taken by the federal government to create governments within tribes that functioned in the way that the federal government and most state governments did. That was the Indian Reorganization Act. And there was sort of a formalized policy to encourage tribes to create constitutions that were tribal constitutions that functioned in the same way as the federal and state constitutions by creating three branches of government: the executive, the legislative, that would be the tribal council, the executive would be the office of the chairperson, or in the tribes that I come from and in the Southwest, they were called or are called governors, and the judicial. These kinds of constitutions allowed tribes to create tribal courts and formalize tribal justice systems in one way or another. There were templates of these constitutions. So if you look at one tribal constitution and another and you see similarity, that's not because those governments were functioning similarly. It was that it's a function of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of Interior tying the creation of these kinds of constitutions and governments to federal funding. So my tribe, for example, the Pueblo of Isleta, has an IRA constitution. It does create three branches of government. It is quite similar to the template, but has been tailored to reflect more of what our tribal values are. But the real power in my community comes from a separate religious government that is run in secret, where sometimes I struggle to think about how to describe this in English. That is functioning in a way to direct what the elected tribal government is doing. And those two governments function in concert. One is named and on the letterhead, the other is not. And in fact, it's a violation of our tribal beliefs to name those individuals who are part of the religious body. So my tribe and many others were able to sort of maintain their tribal governmental structure while at the same time having this tribal constitution. And many other tribes were not able to do that and function entirely based upon the structure that an IRA constitution created. Many reasons for that, tribe to tribe. I don't really want to go into that, but you can certainly do research if you're interested in looking at why that distinction or disparity exists. Well, as a result of that, all of these things and trying to deal with the Indian problem, the federal government recognized that tribes continue to exist, Indian people continue to exist, and Indian ways of life continue to exist. So that moved the federal government to the termination era, where the Congress and the federal government and the Department of Interior simply terminated the existence of many federally recognized tribes. Many of those tribes have been reinstated to federal recognition, and many of them have not and continue to fight for federal recognition. This is an extraordinary measure because if you are a federally recognized tribe, the law says that the federal government has a responsibility called the trust responsibility to ensure that that tribes are able to continue to function, that they are provided, that the members have access to healthcare, that individual tribal members have a right to vote in their own tribal elections. There are all kinds of consequences that flow from being a federally recognized tribe. And for your purposes, in terms of working in Indian child welfare, the most important thing is enrollment and membership in those tribes. So you may have a family who is a Native family, but because they come from a tribe that was terminated in the 50s and the 60s, ICWA won't apply to them. The consequences of termination are significant and ongoing, as are the consequences of all of these acts. And what I hope you'll take away from my discussion today about my own family story is that these are not part of, these approaches to Native people are not part of history. They have consequences up through and continuing now. And so I'm going to kind of trace that as that is sort of elucidated by my own family story. Beginning in the 1970s, really beginning with President Nixon, there was a change in the way that the federal government started to viewed Native communities and tribes. And that's where we really moved into the self-determination era, which is where we remain today. In the 1970s, President Nixon created a much more formalized recognition that the federal government should have a government-to-government relationship with tribes, and that state governments ought to do that as well, or must do that as well. And that tribes have the right to self-govern. what they have the right to self-govern has continued to be debated and ruled upon in the courts, largely in the federal courts, but to some extent in the state courts. But we remain in this era of this government-to-government approach, where the federal government recognizes that tribes have their own tribal governments and requires people who are representative of the federal government, whether they are people from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, whether they are from the Department of the Interior or the Department of Education, to work with tribes in a government-to-government relationship. This has really been foundational to everything that has happened since in tribal relationships with the federal government. And it's certainly a part of the way in which the Indian Child Welfare Act was drafted and continues to function. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So I'm going to tell you the way that some of the story through using my own story. When I went to law school, I never intended to be a lawyer, much less a judge. As some of you may know, I have often said I had never met an attorney before I went to law school. I went to law school because I was interested in understanding how the institution of the law impacted people. And I was interested in the stories that people brought into the courtroom. I was really surprised in my first year of law school that the stories of the people who made up the cases we were reading was really not a part of what we were studying. We were studying the theoretical approaches to how you balance interests. We were studying the way in which the state represents the people in criminal cases. But we almost never talked about what happened for that case to get into the court system and to end up in my case book that I was reading as part of my study. And I was very, very frustrated with that. I really had a hard time figuring out how what I was reading made any sense and had relevance to the way in which I thought in terms of stories, I thought in terms of narrative. And the thing I cared most about was, what's the story behind these cases? I stumbled upon an approach to thinking about the law that has actually been in the news quite a bit in the last year or two, called critical race theory. And there was a great deal of controversy around that analysis of the law. But one of the things that approach brought was the concept of legal storytelling. And it was the concept that if we tell these stories that contradict the primary narrative of the history of our country, the way we have laws and why we have laws, why we criminalize certain things and not others, why the courts get involved in some families and not others. And it was an approach to saying, if we tell those stories, it's a counter narrative to the primary narrative we're given, to the primary history that we're given. That was very meaningful to me because as I was growing up, I went to Department of Defense schools for most of my education from K through 12. Up until 10th grade, I was in Department of Defense schools. My father was in the military. We moved around. I'll talk a little bit about that. And I got the same kind of history education, historical education that most of you probably got when we got to the story of Thanksgiving. It was told from the perspective of the Pilgrims. It was told in a certain way that when I was in college, I was astounded to discover was effectively entirely fictional. And I began to think about, well, what does that mean? How do you tell this truth if the primary story is fiction, but it's taught as history? And this was the answer that made sense to me. this concept of legal storytelling, where members of communities who haven't had a voice get to have a voice by telling these counter narratives. And that fit really well with the oral traditions that my father was raised with, that I understood to be the way in which not just stories were passed down, not just myths that were passed down or religious traditions that were passed down, but law, and the way in which our community or communities resolve disputes. My tribe had virtually no written law, and that was by design. So when I became a tribal judge, which I'll talk about in a little bit, I came into a legal system that had very little written law. Most of the law was law that you learned as a result of hearing from elders and having that oral customary law apply in the courtroom. So this approach to thinking about how the law works and why it functions the way it does made perfect sense to me when I was in law school. I graduated from law school in 1995, at the same time that this theoretical approach to the law using stories became more and more popularized. When I was in my second year of law school, I was just extraordinarily frustrated with this approach that was really theory driven. And I was lucky enough to be able to go to a speech given by Derek Bell. Derek Bell is a professor at NYU. He was a professor at Harvard Law School, and he was an agitator. He wrote many books that were around this idea of narrative and the importance of storytelling and the importance of counter narrative. I listened to his speech. At the time, he was doing a book tour on a book called Confronting Authority that was about his confrontation with the administration of Harvard Law School. He effectively went on strike to protest the failure of Harvard Law School to hire any Black women professors on tenure track. Harvard's response to that was, we'd be glad to if we could find anybody who was qualified to teach here. He found that to be remarkably offensive and wrong. And though he attempted to work through the administration's through the way in which the administration worked, and was unable to make any headway. So he took a very public approach by refusing to teach, and he said he would not return to the classroom until they hired a Black woman professor on tenure track. Ultimately, he was unsuccessful and lost his tenured position at Harvard Law School, and he wrote a book about that. And it's really an extraordinary book about his foundational belief that if you're not willing to put yourself on the line in favor of the things you believe in, then you don't really believe in those things. It was a very powerful idea for me when I was in law school, but I was miserable in law school, and I told him that. I had the opportunity to talk to him after his speech. And I really I think I expected him to be empathetic to my frustration. He wasn't particularly empathetic. Instead, he said, well, I guess you're going to have to work harder. I guess you're going to have to push back. I guess you're going to have to put your effectively life on the line to ensure that the law school hears you and that things begin to change. I took that to heart, and it's something that continues to drive the way I think about my career and my approach to the law. So I tell you my story as part of this counter-narrative tradition that I hope to continue to be a part of. John Hodgman, who you see quoted at the bottom here, some of you probably know who he is, but he's a a comedian and an author, and he has a podcast I recommend to you called the Judge John Hodgman Podcast, where he resolves ridiculous and funny disputes. But he's very thoughtful about also about the way in which narrative works. And he says this all the time: specificity is the soul of narrative. And what he means by that is the more specific you get into your own story, and the more specific you are in telling that story, the better able you are to come to these understanding about generalized things that happen to us all in one form or another. That by telling stories, by being specific about our own stories, we find ways to connect with other people who have similar thoughts, experiences, and ways of thinking. And I have found that to be very much the case. Telling my own family story is hard for me. I am a deeply committed introvert. The nature of this public position that I am now in has been a challenge for me. But continuing to remember who I come from and why I am in this position has been very grounding for me. And so I'm honored to be able to share some of this with you today. So this is my great-great-grandmother, Sachima. It was from the Pueblo of Laguna. One of the things that is sort of an interesting benefit to being a part of the Native community when the federal government was trying to deal with the Indian problem and hope that it went away, was that they were very, very good at taking census numbers and data from tribal communities and documenting the numbers, because their hope was the numbers would go down, and their hope was the numbers would go down to zero. As you know, that didn't happen. But the consequence of that is that you can really find out a lot about your family, and often you can find photographs of family members because of that level of documentation that was going on by the federal government. And so my husband, who is an extraordinary researcher, spent a lot of time developing some of my side of the family's family tree, and has found all kinds of pictures. And I'm going to share a few of those with you today. So this is my great-great-grandmother. She is from the Pueblo of Laguna. The Pueblo of Laguna has been in the news recently because Representative Deborah Haaland has been nominated to be the Secretary of the Interior. She had confirmation hearings this week. And if you look for photographs of her, particularly photographs that are around, that are coming from tribal organizations supporting her nomination to being the cabinet secretary for the Department of the Interior, you will notice that what she is wearing is virtually identical to what you see Sachima wearing in this picture. And if you were to see pictures of me on my wedding day, you would also look at that and be able to recognize that I'm wearing clothes that are virtually identical to what Sachima is wearing today. These clothes communicate information, and some of that information is not information I share publicly. But for example, the necklace she's wearing is called a squash blossom necklace. It is given primarily to married women. Some of them are much more elaborate than the one she has on now. But most Pueblo women have at least one, sometimes more, and sometimes they're very elaborate, sometimes they're less so. You can see her wearing a belt, and I'm going to move my cursor here. This is the belt I'm talking about. This is a woven belt. They are typically made by your maternal aunt and given to you. It communicates information, and you can't see the colors in this black and white picture, but if you look at the photographs of Representative Haaland, who is wearing traditional clothing, I meant to pull my belt out, but I forgot to do it this morning. But I have a belt very similar to the one that she wears. And it continues. This is one of those things that has continued to persist despite all kinds of attempts to eradicate traditional tribal approaches. So this is Jose Paisano. Jose Paisano is my great-great-grandfather. He became the governor of the Pueblo of Laguna, and this picture I love this picture because the seriousness of his face I see that seriousness, or saw that seriousness in my own father's face. You know, I really recognize my family in this picture. So that brings me to Carlisle Boarding School. Many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with the history in this country of sending Native children to boarding schools. This photograph is a picture from the Carlisle Boarding School archives that shows the student body. These are all Native children. Most, if not all of them, were removed from their tribes without the permission of their parents or their tribal governments, and sent to Carlisle Boarding School. There were many of these schools around the country. Some of them were formally run by the U.S. government. Carlisle was one of them. Others of them were run by the Catholic Church, and so you'll see here that I'm showing you that there are 26 government-run boarding schools, but there were many, many more boarding schools than that. And the church worked hand in hand with the federal government with this approach. The approach was to kill the Indian and save the man. Colonel Richard Pratt was very much of the belief that if you could, quote, civilize the Indian, and he was very clear in his written, his writings, as well as in his speeches, that he really believed if you could make Native people speak English, go to Christian church, have traditional Western style hair and clothing, that you could make the Indian someone who was, in his view, respectable and able to be a member of mainstream society. If you're interested in looking at some of this in more detail, the Carlisle Boarding School, Dickinson University has an archive of thousands and thousands of documents related to this, where you can look at newsletters that were written by Richard Pratt, letters that were written by him, some of his speeches, and then there are also thousands upon thousands of photographs. This approach resulted in all kinds of pain, I guess is the way I would describe it. So when I look at this picture of all of these children dressed in clothing that is identical to one another, despite the fact that many of them come from different tribes, I just think about what they must have thought, having been yanked from their tribal communities, sent to these boarding schools where they lived in dorms, where they had dorm mothers and fathers whose responsibility was to effectively beat the Native out of them, and they did that. Anytime one of these kids spoke in a language other than English, they were physically abused for that. When they arrived at Carlisle Boarding School, their hair was, if it was long, was often cut. And I think when we look at this picture and we sort of see this kind of sepia tone, black and white picture, it feels like it was a long time ago. And I'm here to tell you that it wasn't, that this is a pain when Native people, particularly people like me who have family members who were sent to this or other boarding schools, this is a very current experience because it has consequences that impact the generations that are around today and that you work with as people who are working in Indian child welfare. Carlisle was extraordinary at documentation, and that was because Colonel Pratt was really determined to prove that his experiment was functional and that it should be continued. So they took before and after pictures of all kinds. This photograph is one that we found fairly recently, and it's a much more informal picture than the ones I'm going to show you in a moment. And I like this picture because I think it's much more candid. This is a picture of children from Laguna and other pueblos right around when they arrived, if not the day they arrived or close to it, from New Mexico to Carlisle boarding school, which was in Pennsylvania. I don't think you can get much more different. New Mexico, central New Mexico to Pennsylvania. And so again, I look at this picture and I don't see a single person smiling or looking like they are where they want to be or where they ought to be. And so when I look at this picture, I see my family because my family is in it. This here where I'm putting my cursor. So if you can't see the cursor, it's the taller woman to the right in the center of the three kids that are standing. That's Mary Perry or Kiotse, who is my great grandmother and the daughter of Sachima. So she was removed from Laguna, placed on a train and sent to Carlisle boarding school. This is not an uncommon story from the Pueblos. There are many, many people to whom I am related by blood or tradition who have these stories and have these kinds of photographs. So this is the more stylized photograph. Mary Perry was born in around 1865, and she was at Carlisle boarding school from between 1880 to either 1884 or 1886. There's some conflicting documents about that. Again, I want you to pay attention to the clothing that she's wearing. The black wool that she has on here, so it is full length, is called a manta, and she's wearing a belt that is a clan belt, and she's wearing an undershirt underneath it, and that is also, it's hard to tell here, but it's also full length. It likely has lace that's been tatted by her maternal aunt, and that is a very typical thing to have as part of your traditional clothing. These two young men who are in this picture are Benjamin Thomas and John Chavez, and they are there will be a picture I'll show you in a moment that shows them after Carlisle boarding school. So this is it's hard to see it. I'm just showing it to you primarily so that for you to just sort of see what I'm talking about in terms of the newsletters. This is called the Indian Helper. The Carlisle boarding school website has most of the editions of this, and they are really quite remarkable in terms of the way they describe the student body. It's not in this screenshot, but there's another page of this newsletter, and this appears in many others, where they talk about how much a native child costs. So you can purchase a native child from Carlisle boarding school. They're advertised as maids. Sometimes they're just advertised as children if you want to, quote unquote, adopt a native child. And they're sort of served up for consumption by the people who read this. This newsletter also functions as a fundraising letter, and in many of these newsletters, Colonel Pratt talks about the importance of his work and how expensive it is, and seeks donations. And part of the adoption structure that came out of Carlisle boarding school was described as a way to continue to provide funding for Carlisle boarding school to continue to, as I said before, kill the Indian and save the man. So I just will read a little bit about this. I'm starting here, and as I said, it's hard to see. So I'll read it to you. Indian boys, Indian girls, do you think you should have as good chances to learn and get ahead in this world as any race of people? The man on the bandstand thinks you should. You know what the reservation is like, don't you? Do you think that a race of people who sit upon a little reservation by themselves can get on very fast? But if our government tells the Indians to stay there, they have to do it. Just as long as the Indians are ignored, they will have to do what the people of knowledge and power tell them to do, no matter whether the demands are just or unjust. The Indians cannot help themselves. They may try to help themselves by fighting, but Indian fighting never lasts long. A few Indians and a few soldiers get killed. The Indians have to give up sooner or later. The war ends and the Indian is poorer and still ignorant. How are you going to get out of this trouble? What is going to help you? Education, education, education. The friends of Indians want to educate, the best friends of Indians want to educate them in the very quickest way. What is the use in taking 100 years to do something that can be accomplished in 10 years? As long as all Indian children are kept in Indian schools with all Indian surroundings, they will remain all Indian. As soon as the Indian begins to come out from his Indian surroundings to live and work with industrious people, the end is near. He will soon be able to manage his own affairs as a citizen of the United States and be a man instead of a slave, as he now is. I hope that you can hear some of the echoes of that in today's world, because I'm here to tell you it continues to persist. A little bit more of Colonel Pratt. It's a great mistake to think that the Indian is born an inevitable savage. He's born a blank, like the rest of us. Left in surroundings of savagery, he grows to possess a savage language, superstition, and life. When we allow him the freedom of association and the developing influences of social contact, then the Indian will quickly demonstrate that he can be truly civilized, and he himself will solve the question of what to do with the Indian. So I think when we look at this, this is in the 1890s, and I think many people look at this and obviously it's extraordinarily racist. And I think folks often look at this and want to say, well, this was the prevailing view in the 1900s, early 1900s, and we've really, really changed. And to an extent, I think that that's the case. But again, I go back to this last week where the hearings for Deborah Haaland occurred for her confirmation as Department of the Interior. And I also reflect on my campaign last year. Both of us were asked this question in one form or another. And I was asked this question by my opponent in my campaign. She was asked this question by Senator Manchin as well as others. And the question was, how can anyone expect that you can be objective, that you can be trusted to be fair when a situation arises in your work that involves an Indian tribe? How could the other side be expected to believe that you can be objective and arrive at a decision that is just or equitable? I think that's a stunning question. I was sort of surprised that I was asked that question by my opponent during my campaign. I was not at all surprised that Representative Holland was asked that question, and she was clearly prepared for it. And I think that she was prepared for it because, like me, she's been asked those questions over and over again. It's not a question that was asked of Mayor Buttigieg during his confirmation for the Secretary of Transportation. And I defy you to look at any of the confirmation hearings from anyone other than Representative Holland and find that question asked. Because the assumption is that because you are a Native person who was raised in with beliefs about being Native, particularly if you were someone like Representative Holland who speaks the Karasan language, which Pratt describes as a savage language, if you were raised in the religious traditions of your community, which Pratt describes as superstition, if you were raised in the traditional ways of life, which are very much thriving in New Mexico at Laguna and Isleta, which is what Pratt describes as life. These things are things that have impacts on the way people think of people like me and Representative Holland today. Representative Holland was one of my students when I taught at the University of New Mexico School of Law. I recall I was a legal writing professor. She and I had many conversations about the relative importance of learning to write like a lawyer when she had been taught to think in a way that was very different from the way in which I was training her and others, many others. I had hundreds of students to write as an attorney. And one of the questions that we talked about, and that I've talked about with many students and many friends, was how much we lose in the course of learning to write in that manner, to think in that manner, to speak in that manner. And it's a real question. I don't have great answers for that, except that I know that in order to be successful as I have been and as she has been, it's very important to be able to speak in that language, whether that's written or verbal. And I'm very good at it, as you can see, because I learned how to do it. I learned how to write legal language and speak it, and there's loss associated with that, which I'll talk about in more detail now. This is the after picture. So this is the same three kids from the picture before. They are obviously older. The boys have had their hair cut. They are wearing military uniforms. Carlisle Boarding School was effectively a military school. The boys were trained as soldiers. Continues to be a very significant ethic in many, if not all, tribal communities of service in the military. So there are many thousands of military veterans who are tribal members. And it's a very proud tradition in tribal communities, which seems to often come as a surprise for many. But I think some of that stems from this approach of education, that education is really a military endeavor. The women in Carlisle Boarding School were trained in primarily domestic life, in the sense that they were taught to sew, to cook. They were often sent out into the community to work as maids for white families. And as I described before, sometimes they were sold as maids and caretakers for children and so forth for white families who sought that. The way that Mary Perry has her hair here is not in the traditional fashion. I point that out because in many tribes, not all, but many tribes, hair and the way you wear your hair is is connected to the religious traditions of the tribe. And so when I look at this picture with all three of these young people, I notice that because none of them would have been raised by their own communities to have hair that looked like that. So this is, whoops, go back. This is a picture from the wedding day of my grandparents. So this picture, this here is Mary Perry again. Again, note the clothing. And if you can't really see it on the picture of Mary Perry, but this is my my other great grandmother, Petra Jojola, who is from the Pueblo of Isleta. And you can see her squash blossom is more detailed here. So this is my great grandmother from Isleta, and Juan Antonio Montoya is my great grandfather from Isleta. This was the picture taken on the wedding day of my grandparents to each other. My grandmother, May Paisano, was part of the Laguna tribe. My grandfather, Bart Montoya, who's the children of these two, is from the Pueblo of Isleta. It's very common to have intermarriage between the two Pueblos. They're about 25 miles apart as the crow flies. Historically, there was significant relationship between those two tribes, and there are, in fact, I come from a long tradition of runners. Pueblo people are runners. And there are trails that go from the Pueblo, the village of the Pueblo of Isleta, to the village of the Pueblo of Laguna that are ancient trails that were run by runners who were exchanging messages and information back and forth between the two tribes. As I said, this is the wedding day of my grandparents. I want to tell you a little bit more about Mary Perry. So we have letters Mary Perry wrote back to Colonel Pratt once she returned to Laguna. I want to point out that I feel very lucky that my grandmother, my great grandmother, survived the experience at Carlisle boarding school. Many children never returned home. Many of them died as a result of being exposed to disease that they had no immunity to. And as my good friend, Judge Bill Thorne, with whom I have done many trainings of judges on the Indian Child Welfare Act, as Judge Thorne often says, many of those children who are buried in mass graves at Carlisle boarding school died of broken hearts. They just could not survive the experience of being removed from their communities and placed in these boarding schools where they couldn't practice their faith and they couldn't speak their languages. There are also extraordinary stories of children who ran away from Carlisle boarding school and traveled hundreds and some thousands of miles to return to their communities. I have no idea how they managed to do it, but there are many stories that have been documented about those returns. My grandmother, like many others, graduated from Carlisle and came back to her tribe. She came back to her tribe with the express purpose of wanting to teach her tribal community, the Pueblo of Laguna, what she had learned, which was to become a Christian, to speak English and learn to write in English, and stop speaking the Karasan language. I don't think I would be surprised if she in fact stopped speaking the Karasan language, because that was the primary language at Laguna and continues to be to this day. But we have letters she wrote back to Colonel Pratt expressing her sense of failure for being able or unable to convert her community in the way that Colonel Pratt expected. Pratt kept quite significant contact with her. He came to visit her at Laguna several years after her graduation, as did his wife. And the letters she wrote back to him are very painful for me to read, because she feels that she wasn't able to do what her education taught her to do. And I think that really was a struggle and a conflict for her. one of the things that she really took from that experience was the importance of education. And in the piece that I read you can see how much the idea of education, but a certain kind of education, was the children were inculcated with the importance of that form of education. And that has continued to have an impact up through today in my family. This is a photograph of my grandfather. My grandfather, Bartolo Montoya, lived at the Pueblo of Isleta for most of his life, not all of it, because some of his life was spent at Haskell Indian School, which was another boarding school. However, this school was a school that where his parents consented to sending him to. So you see a shift from the forced removal of those children to, at least in the case of my grandfather, the voluntary placement of their children or child at Haskell Indian School. This is his graduation photograph. I look at this picture and I see his short hair, the suit he's wearing. I see that at least in this picture, although this wasn't actually true in my life with him and my father's life with him, certainly, but he looks very much like any photograph you'd see of anyone who graduated from high school or college at that time. So he was trained as a teacher. He went to college, at least to 2 years of college, to become a teacher and to teach on reservations, but to teach in the format that Mary Perry was taught in. And so was my grandmother. My grandmother met my grandfather at Haskell Indian School. This is a picture at the top of her graduation photo. So the same picture that was taken of my grandfather. And every time I see this photograph, of course I see my grandmother, but I also am sort of struck by the pearls, the dress that she's wearing, and in particular, her hairstyle. I cannot imagine the effort that must have gone into getting her hair to have those sort of waves or curls. My hair is very similar to my grandmother's hair, and as long as I knew her, it was dead straight, just like mine, just like my father's. And so, I sort of look at that and really see someone trying to carry out what she had been taught, that there is a certain way to look, and it certainly isn't the picture that's on the bottom, and it's certainly not the traditional ways of dressing that you see in the prior pictures. My grandparents taught at schools on reservations for much of their life. My grandfather was also a farmer at the Pueblo of Isleta, in a home that I inherited after my grandfather died, and that I lived in for some time after law school. My grandparents very much believed in the importance of formalized education, and they sent my father to the Albuquerque Indian School. These buildings no longer exist, but they existed up until relatively recently. And in fact, I spent some time in this building, and my father spent many years in this building. He was also sent to a Catholic high school where he was routinely beaten for speaking the Tiwa language, which is the language spoken at Isleta, where he grew up. And he didn't talk about it very often, but when he did talk about it, he talked about how the nuns beat him when he slipped into speaking the Tiwa language to his friends who were sitting around him. This school, the Albuquerque Indian School, this is another student body picture here. And again, I look at the clothes of these children, and I certainly don't see traditional Pueblo clothing anywhere here, nor do I really see traditional hair or anything along those lines. So when you get to my father was voluntarily sent by my grandparents to both Albuquerque Indian School and the Catholic high school that he went to. They both consented to him effectively being abused and certainly traumatized for speaking his language. And my father deeply believed in the importance of education when it came to raising me. I'm an only child. My father, who is here, was in the Air Force. He joined the Air Force when he graduated from high school. He joined the ROTC at the University of New Mexico with a promise to serve in the military and the Air Force following his graduation from college. And I think his expectation, that was the way he was able to finance going to college. I think his expectation, well, I know his expectation was that he'd serve the time that he agreed to and then leave and return to New Mexico. But ultimately, he did not. He loved serving in the military. He was a career U.S. Air Force officer and until he retired. And following his retirement, he returned to working for the Air Force as a civilian in Albuquerque. He spent a little bit of time working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs between. But really his heart was in serving as a member and then as a civilian working for the U.S. Air Force. He was deeply committed to public service and raised me with that ethic that if I chose not to serve in the military, which I did not, that I serve in some way and that I become skilled in the way that he had to become skilled in what he talked about as walking in both worlds. He was, as you might imagine in his experience in the Air Force, almost always the only native in the room as an officer. He was also a civil engineer. And so again, he was the only native. He also served in the intelligence forces during the Vietnam War, which was not something he ever spoke to me about. And in fact, when I asked him about it, if he'd ever served in Vietnam, he did not tell me the truth. He said no. I only found out about his extraordinary service in Vietnam, his very dangerous service in Vietnam, following his death, when I was told that he had received one of the highest military honors for his service in Vietnam. But that experience really scarred him to the point that he denied it ever happened. And it was trauma upon trauma. My father very much struggled with teaching me the Tiwa and the Karasan languages. He wanted me to speak those languages, but he also viewed those languages as dangerous, that the consequence of speaking those languages in mixed company, and because he was in the Air Force and we moved around a lot, we were almost always in mixed company, would result, he was fearful that it would result in the kind of abuse towards me that he experienced, the physical beatings, the judgment, and the other things he experienced as part of his education. He wanted me to get the education. He wanted me to speak the languages. He didn't want me to experience the trauma that he experienced. That trauma had an impact on my father every day of his life that I remember. He was, without question, extremely pained by the trauma that he endured. It is a miracle that he was able to have a very successful career in life, because I know it was very difficult for him. And I watched that. I understood that, particularly as a young adult. I don't know that I really understood it as a young person. As I was growing up, we always came back to Isleta. I understood that was my home. And I was brought back particularly for important parts of my life where there were ceremonies, naming ceremonies. And this picture where I'm about 9 years old is a picture from one of my naming days. As a lot of people have 3 different names. The name you're given, the Tiwa name you're given at birth, another that you get around the age of 9 or 10, and then another as you're moving into adulthood. This was one of my naming days. And you will notice that I'm not wearing a squash blossom. I'm wearing some coral beads. I still have that necklace. And then underneath the manta, again, you can see the top of the red and white dress, or really shirt, that's underneath there. You can see my father wearing the same. And you can see the lace in this picture a little bit better. And that lace was certainly tatted by probably his maternal aunt from Laguna. You can't really see it in this picture, but I don't have a belt yet because I received it that day. This was taken before those ceremonies. My mother is from Australia. It's a very long story to how she got to meeting my father, but she met my father in Spain. My father was stationed at an Air Force base in Spain. My mother was in Spain and met my father there. And that's how I came to be. Well, it's how I came to be, but it's also how I came to be born in Spain. And as I said, we moved around all over the place. As a result of that, I grew up with a great deal of struggle because I didn't speak my language, the Tiwa language, particularly well. I got better at understanding it when I lived at Isleta after law school, and it was where I served as a tribal judge. Where I first served as a tribal judge for my own community. The tribal court proceedings were often carried out in the Tiwa language, so I actually had to have an interpreter for me to be sure that I caught everything that was happening when people were speaking or testifying in my courtroom. And I was very young as a judge. I was asked to come and serve as a tribal court judge within about 2.5 years of my graduation from law school. My mentor, who I worked for 2 years after I graduated from law school, Justice Pamela Minsner, when I was asked to be a tribal court judge, I talked to her about that. And she said, you really need more time as a lawyer before you become a judge. And I talked to my father about it, and he said, there's no way that you should do this job. You can't sit in judgment of your own people. Both Justice Minsner and my dad were right. But I did that job anyway, which gives you a little bit of insight into who I am. And it was very difficult, and it had very serious consequences for me in the long term. And part of that story is a different talk that I give, that I've begun to give actually very recently. But part of the consequence of serving for my own tribe was that when the tribal court was sort of in the middle of a battle between the religious traditional government at Isleta and the elected branch of government, the consequence of being a judge that had to mediate that landed me in the room with the governor of Isleta and 2 of his lieutenant governors, in my court clerk, who often served as my Tiwa interpreter, where they asked me what I would rule in that case. And I said to them, you are parties to this case. I'm not going to discuss this case with you, nor am I going to tell you what my decision would be in this case. We went around and around for about 3 hours, and ultimately they understood that they weren't going to bully or badger me into ruling in their favor, or telling them that I would, or telling them what I would do. And I was asked to leave my job as a tribal judge. And at that point, I thought, I'm never doing this again. I'm never going to be a judge again. It's just too difficult. And I left that room knowing that that was not going to be the last I would hear of it. And it was not. I was ultimately disenrolled by that same part of the tribal government from my tribe, And I remained disenrolled for about 10 years, maybe a little bit longer. In the midst of that disenrollment, and there, as you may have known, there's a great deal of disenrollment controversies going on for many tribes, including some here, and I presided over a very significant case at the Nooksack Indian tribe when that was happening there. During the course of the time where I was not enrolled, nobody really knew why. I didn't talk about it. It was too painful. I can't really express to you in ways that I think you could understand what it means to be told by your community that you are not wanted, particularly given that the reason I returned to New Mexico was because once I had the education of being a lawyer, and some of you know, I also obtained a master's in social work at the same time, was that I believed my job was to serve my community in some form. I represented tribes as a private attorney, and I also served as a tribal court judge, and I believed that that was my very important, that I give back to my own community, which had supported me in many ways. And so what the consequence of being a tribal court judge was not just the loss of my membership in my own tribe, but also the loss of my home. I was, as a non-tribal member, not allowed to live on the reservation in the home that I owned, because I couldn't own property. If you're not a tribal member, you can't own property within the reservation at my tribe. It is the reason I came back to Washington. My husband is from Tacoma, and in the face of looking like we were going to lose our home, I started looking for work elsewhere, and I was lucky enough to obtain the job I got as a professor at Western Washington University. When I got there, I really got to Bellingham ready to be a professor, which was always what I had wanted to do. I had been also a professor at the University of New Mexico Law School. And I was ready to make that my career. I came there thinking I'm never going to be a tribal judge again. It's just too much. And probably within 6 months, I was working as a tribal judge for Lummi. And that was, largely because the need for having tribal court judges is just, it's really critical. And especially judges who understand child welfare, which is an area I worked in and very significant part of my practice as both a judge and as a practitioner, as well as an academic. And so that continued my work as a tribal court judge, and ultimately being a judge took over being a professor, and as you know, has led me to where I am today. So part of what I want you to think about when you hear my story is this question of what it means to belong. The question of belonging in communities where there has been a multiple centuries long attempt to destroy them is a very real question. The kinds of disputes you see and that you hear as if you're doing ICWA cases around membership or non-membership, upon membership in multiple tribes, it's all about this question. How do we continue to survive as a people in a country that doesn't want us? And I see the reflections of not being wanted in hundreds of ways. But I thought that this poll was just kind of the cherry on top kind of example. Last year, during all of the protests that were occurring as a result of the killing of George Floyd, the movement to change the name of the Washington football team had a little bit more traction than it had in years past. The very first case I worked on, which was in my first semester or first quarter at the University of Washington Law School, was a case that I worked on with a professor on writing a brief to the U.S. Patent and Trade Office, which deals with trademarks. The Washington team's trademark was up for renewal, and several tribes led by Suzanne Schoen-Harjo wrote briefs and appeared in front of the Trade Commission, arguing that the name should not be continued to be trademarked because it was a racial slur. So this was in 1992. This fight, led by Suzanne Harjo and joined by many others, has been going on for a very long time. And for the first time in that fight, the changing of the name really looked like it had traction as a result of sort of being pushed along with the wave of protests occurring around racial injustice around the country and around the world. So this was a poll that was taken right around the time when the Washington team was just about to announce the name change. And what I find remarkable about this poll is when you look at, on the far left at the bottom, of who they asked about whether or not the Washington team should change their name. They did not ask Native people. Maybe were captured in other adults, I don't know. But it is a remarkable example, in my view, that from really the beginning and founding of this country up through today, we are often a second thought when decisions are being made about us. And I think this poll really underscores that. And the reason I want to point that out is to ask you to reflect upon the importance of ensuring that if you have an ICWA case, that the tribes are given an opportunity to participate. And I will tell you that very often, and you all, I'm sure, have had this experience, a tribe intervenes in a case, but then they don't take much action in the sense that they aren't necessarily appearing at every hearing. They aren't necessarily saying much about what their view is in the case. And very often, that's a question of resources. As some of you, maybe all of you know, there is no consistent means of funding for tribal courts. Tribes themselves have to come up with it. They have to fund it through grants, but there's no stable source of funding for tribal courts. There is also no stable source of funding for child welfare units at tribes. Tribes have to come up with a way to fund that if they're going to do it. Many tribes can't, and for a variety of reasons. And many tribes, in order to marshal those resources, have someone that's kind of monitoring what's going on in an ICWA case, but really only come into a hearing close to the time at which a termination petition is filed, or when some kind of critical decision-making point is happening, because that's really all they can afford to do. And I will tell you that I have had conversations with my colleagues at the Supreme Court about that dynamic. Most of them had never really understood that or thought about it. And they sort of viewed ICWA cases when tribes did not, in their view, use the rights they were given by ICWA, viewed the tribes as not really caring. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's not about caring, it's about resources. And it's about how tribes can divvy up those resources and when they're available and when they are not. These are two pictures from my swearing in. This is me signing my oath. This was right after I was sworn in. When I was appointed to this position, I'll first say that when Chief Justice Fairhurst announced her retirement, and I was asked by some folks to consider applying for the position, it really seemed like an extraordinary long shot for me, given the reality of the numbers, or the lack of numbers, of Native people sitting on state Supreme Courts or state courts at all. I spent the vast majority of the 5 years I served as a Superior Court judge, being the only Native state court judge at any level in the state of Washington, which is a statistic that should shock you. And what that meant was that when I was in rooms where decisions were being made, I was almost always the only Native person in the room. And I was very often the only person of color or woman of color in the room at tables that were very important, making very important decisions that impacted people in my communities. And when I say communities, obviously I'm in Washington, but I mean tribal communities with whom that I felt I had a responsibility to represent in those meetings. I thought it was very unlikely that I would be appointed to this position because I could not see anyone in the country who had a path like mine to the highest court in the state. When I did get appointed, I was incredibly gratified and surprised and excited and terrified. And I was given the opportunity by Chief Justice Stevens to create the swearing-in ceremony in a way that reflected what I wanted. And I was very grateful to have that opportunity. And I was grateful to have the Port Campbell Slalom singers and drums come, as well as to have President Fawn Sharp introduce me and do the invocation, and to have the extraordinary support of tribes around the state. And I want to tell you, as I'm wrapping up here, what it means to have a voice at this most important of tables. Probably most of you are familiar with the Greer case, or the ZJG case that I wrote in the summer of last year on the Indian Child Welfare Act, and when courts ought to have a reason to know that they have an Indian Child Welfare Act case in front of them. So assignments to justices of particular cases is random. And I got this case assigned to me through a random case draw. I don't know how random it is if you think about the big universal picture and the spirits of my ancestors who guide me. But I got that case, and I had a decision to make. And the decision was, am I going to write this in sort of the staid legal writing tone that I see most cases written in, or am I going to write it in the spirit of the way I was told to tell stories? And I decided that while there may be people who read that opinion and say, well, she was always going to rule this way because she's a Native person, which was not the case. I looked at the law. I decided that it was more important to push back on that and tell a story, because that's how we work in tribal communities, and it's how I think. So I told a story in that case, and it was very important to me to do it in that way. And perhaps the most shocking thing that I want to underscore here about that opinion is that it appears to be the first opinion in any state court system written about the Indian Child Welfare Act by an Indian. And it may be one of the first cases looking at an issue in Indian law written by a Native person. That's extraordinary to me. And it's partially why I've talked about Representative Holland in the course of this talk, because Representative Holland is being nominated and hopefully confirmed to the department to be the Secretary of the Department of the Interior. She'll be the first cabinet secretary in the history of this country who is Native, and the first, of course, Secretary of the Department of the Interior who is Native. The Department of the Interior has been tasked with making decisions about tribes since the development of this country, and it's never been led by a Native person, much less a Native woman. So I think that if you go back and look at her opening statement during her confirmation, which I believe started on Wednesday of this week. Her opening statement is really an extraordinary and historical thing, because she introduces herself in the way I've described. It's shorter. I understand, because I work under the same strictures, that you can't go into the level of detail that I've gone into today with you to introduce myself. But she does attempt to do that in a way that at least I'm sure it was very important to her to feel like she had a place in that room. And so having the drums and the voices of the singers at my swearing in allowed me to feel like these marble walls that you see in this photograph of the court, that is Justice Wiggins on the bottom right is no longer a member of this court. He's retired, and Governor Inslee appointed Justice Helen Whitener to that seat. So this isn't the most current photograph of the bench. But when I walked in those halls, the first day I think I was appointed to that position, as I walked up the stairs to this extraordinarily imposing building, I just kept thinking, none of this was built with someone like me in mind. And I have to figure out a way to make it feel like it's okay that I'm there. And that was the way I did it, through having a swearing in. And then since then, I have really attempted to continue to be connected to tribal communities. I very much miss working in Indian country, which I did for the first 15 years of my career. And this picture on the top here is Justice Yu and I. So this is Justice Yu on the second from the left, and then I'm here in the middle. We went to Spokane to meet with all kinds of people in Spokane, and it was a trip we took almost exactly a year ago, right before we all went into lockdown. I think we really threaded the needle to do that, and I think this was my last public event. And we met with a lot of tribal leaders that you see in this picture from the Spokane area. And then the picture on the right is a young woman named Davina, and this is her mom, Angelique, behind her. And her mom came up to me at the end of the day at a different event. We probably met 500 people that day, and said, my daughter would really like to meet you, because she was, when she saw you appointed, she said that it meant that she herself could do anything. And I have a hard time talking about that without crying, or at least tearing up. But it was really remarkable to listen to her talk about what it meant to her to see a Native woman. She read a letter during my campaign, at one of my campaign events, that was just extraordinary about how it changed her view of what was possible. None of that was possible without the extraordinary sacrifices of the people who came before me. And I just want to thank all of you for giving me the time to share some of that story. So I'm going to stop the share here, and if there are questions, I'm happy to take them.
Justice, I just want to thank you for sharing your story with me, because it's close to my heart. And as an American Indian woman, I was sharing my story yesterday in the session that I do in wrapping up the ICWA Institute. And I kept thinking to myself, you have inspired so many American Indian people to know that they can do anything. And that just makes my heart smile. Video yesterday, We Shall Remain, which is, you can find it on the ICWA website, and it's filmed on the Coeur d'Alene Reservation, and it has quite a few of the Kalispel youth on it, and it's very touching, because we shall remain. We're very resilient. We're very strong, and much of your story brought me to tears because of my own. So thank you. I honor you, and I'm just so blessed today. And I'm going to look in the chat box for a moment.
Okay, thank you, Lorley.
Actually, there's just a lot of wow. That was remarkable. I'm so glad I had this opportunity to hear the presentation. And I did watch your swearing in, and it was it was beautiful. It was just very beautiful. And yesterday I talked about the boarding schools, and it happened to real people, and that's our continued healing process,
Yep.
even to this day. Amazing, moving. Thank you so much for your story. And I just sometimes I say, I'm just a storyteller. Let me just go off. And so,
I get it.
Yeah, I know. I just know that having people, Indian people, share their stories, knowing the families and what has gone on, and knowing the truth of what has happened, I think brings people closer to the understanding. I understand about being the only brown person in a room, and I continue to have courageous conversations, and I just thank you. You very inspiring. Thank you for taking the time. Very powerful. Just a lot of thank yous, Your Honor. And I'm going to make sure that you see a lot of these. There's a lot. And yes, very grateful. I know that your story has touched many hearts today, as I know it has touched mine. And Ryan, if we can make sure that Justice gets these comments, I would appreciate that. And I just, thank you. And as I continue to say, we are all one heart in Kuspu'us, because we are one heart. And so please continue asking the questions, continue being for the Indian children and families, not just children, but the families as a whole and the community as a whole. Thank you, Justice.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, thank you. And we're going to be asking you for in-person later on this year.
Oh, wow. That will be great.
It will
Hard
be
to
great.
imagine.
That will be an interesting time for sure.
Yes, I've gotten used to being in my 10 by 10 office at home.
Right, yes. So I have nothing else. Is there anything, any questions for Judge? As I say, Judge, Your Honor. I know.
I answered all of it, I guess.
I know, right? Yeah, I tell people, just call me anything, just don't call me late for dinner.
That's right.
My goodness. Okay.
Well, thanks to all of you. I appreciate your time and attention, and I'm very grateful for your thanks as well.
Thank you.
All right. All right. Bye. Thank you.
See you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Justice Montoya-Lewis.
It was wonderful.
Thank you, Miss Laura.
You're welcome. You all have a really great weekend, and thank you for the happy birthday wishes.
You too. You have a great birthday today. Go do something fun.
Yeah, like go have a manicure.
There you go.
I know. All right, y'all.
I hope you get cake, Laura.
Yeah, at least ice cream.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
See you.
Bye.